Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Paulo Freire lecture on education and social transformation. This is a biannual lecture series organized and sponsored by the College of Education and the Center for Brazilian Studies here at San Diego State University. The first in this biannual lecture series is titled Social Justice in Applied Linguistics, Critical Perspectives on Language Teaching, Research, and Civic Engagement, and will be delivered by Dr. Anya of Penn State University. On behalf of the College of Education and the Center for Brazilian Studies, it is truly an honor to welcome Dr. Anya as our scholar presenter in this virtual space, honoring a great champion in the quest of social justice, the Brazilian Paulo Freire. Eu não falo muito português, mas eu vou tentar. Bom dia, boa tarde e bem-vindos, bem-vindas à palestra inaugural Paulo Freire sobre educação e transformação social. Palestra promovida pela Faculdade de Educação e pelo Centro de Estudos Brasileiros da Universidade Estadual de San Diego. A palestra deste ano, intitulada Justiça Social em Linguística Aplicada, Perspectivas Críticas no Ensino das Línguas, Pesquisa e Engajamento Cívico, será ministrada pela doutora Anya, da Penn State University. Em nome da Faculdade de Educação e do Centro de Estudos Brasileiros, é realmente uma honra receber a doutora Anya como palestrante neste espaço virtual para homenagear Paulo Freire. Bem-vinda, welcome. Bem-vinda, Dr. Anya. Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos y bienvenides a esta conferencia inaugural Paulo Freire sobre educación y transformación social y auspiciada por la Facultad de Educación y por el Centro de Estudios Brasileños de la Universidad Estatal de San Diego. La conferencia de este año, titulada Justicia Social en la Lingüística Aplicada, Perspectivas Críticas sobre la Enseñanza de Lenguas, la Investigación y el Compromiso Cívico, estará a cargo de la doctora Anya, profesora en la Universidad Estatal de Pensilvania. En nombre de la Facultad de Educación y del Centro de Estudios Brasileños de nuestra universidad, es un verdadero honor darle la bienvenida a la doctora Anya a este espacio virtual, un espacio dedicado a la memoria y al trabajo del gran pensador y activista de la educación y la justicia social, el brasileño Paulo Freire. My name is Christian Aquino Sterling, and currently I serve as a faculty member and as Associate Dean for Diversity and International Affairs in the College of Education here at San Diego State. And I am really honored to facilitate and co-facilitate this event with Dr. Erica Rapp-Larkins and Dr. Crystal Bobina, respectively the director and the assistant director of our dynamic and impactful Center for Brazilian Studies. But before we continue, please be informed that after the presentation, there will be an opportunity for you to share your comments and or your questions with Dr. Anya. At that point, please feel free to post your comments, questions via the Q&A chat. On behalf of our Dean, Y. Barry Chung, our Dean in the College of Education, I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Erica Rapp-Larkins, the director of the Center for Brazilian Studies, for taking the initiative to invite the College of Education to jointly create and sponsor the Paulo Freire Lecture on Education and Social Transformation. I also want to express much gratitude to Dr. Crystal Bobina, the Center Assistant Director, for all of the organizational logistical work that she has done in order to bring this event to you and to us today. Muito obrigado, Erica e Crystal, em nome da Colégio de Educação, Faculdade de Educação. And now, a little bit on Paulo Freire. As many of you Freirean scholars who are here, service professionals, community activists, and our students of Freire's transformative philosophy know, the impact of Paulo Freire in the field of education, community development, and even community health cannot be underestimated. I am sure, and we are sure, that you will all agree with us that Freire's ideas of conscientização, liberation, and praxis could not be more relevant and suitable for advancing social transformation through education in today's challenging world societies. Societies where, through still extant systems of social, cultural, racial, linguistic, and many other forms of oppression, the powerful continues to dehumanize the other, and in that process, to dehumanize themselves. But we must not lose hope. Freire's work and legacy continues to serve as an inspiration for moving the agenda of social transformation and human freedoms forward. We must continue to create critical, reflective, and humanizing spaces such as this virtual space for advancing both personal and social healing and transformation. This is the true reason why the College of Education and the Center for Brazilian Studies, in their commitment to advancing human flourishing, have joined collaborative energies to sponsor this lecture. And we do so in honor of Paulo Freire, a great scholar activist who helped us to understand how education can serve as a bridge leading towards social justice and human freedom for all. And with this, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Erica Rabb-Larkins, the director of the Center for Brazilian Studies, and who will be introducing our esteemed guest and scholar presenter today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you, Christian. My name is Erica Rabb-Larkins, and I'm the director of the Boehner-Stiefel Center for Brazilian Studies. So I also want to echo some of the thanks that we've heard already. This time to thank Christian Aquino Sterling for the idea for this collaboration, and also to Dean Y. Barry Chung for supporting it. So we're really excited to for this inaugural lecture of what is going to be an ongoing collaboration. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to say one more thing about the Q&A. In Zoom webinar, we're going to use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. So you can put questions there at any time, either in English or in Portuguese. Please don't put the questions in the chat, put them in the Q&A, otherwise we might not see them. And Dr. Anya will address the questions at the end of the talk, and we will dar jeito com tradução, né? So you can put them in either English or Portuguese, and we'll address them at the end. This event, like all of our virtual events, is being recorded, and it's going to be available for viewing on the website of our new Digital Brazil project and on our YouTube channel. So I really encourage everyone to follow us on that site and let your friends and students and fellow researchers and colleagues know about this, that they can watch the lecture afterwards on these sites. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Anya is an assistant professor of second language learning in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and a research affiliate with the Center for the Study of Higher Education at Penn State University. She specializes in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and second language education, with a particular focus on race, gender, sexual and social class identities in the language classroom. Her other interests include applied linguistics as a practice of social justice and translanguaging and world language pedagogy. Dr. Anya's most recent publications are the article African Americans in World Language Study, The Forged Path and Future Directions, which was published in the 40th anniversary issue of the Annual Review of Applied Linguistics from 2020. And her book, Racialized Identities in Second Language Learning, Speaking Blackness in Brazil, from Routledge in 2017, which is the winner of the 2019 American Association for Applied Linguistics First Book Award, which recognizes a scholar whose first book represents outstanding work that makes an exceptional contribution to the field. So Dr. Anya, we're so pleased that you are here. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Obrigada também. I'm very, very happy to be here, and I'm also thrilled to represent the Penn State College of Education in collaboration with the spirit of this event and the co-sponsor, your College of Education. I'm here to give the presentation. I'll also be on the chat during the video. And of course, we'll have a robust Q&A afterwards. Eu gostaria de dar bem-vindas a todas, o pessoal do Brasil, os falantes de português, que eu prometia no Twitter que haverá tradução em português. Vai ver, né? A fala que vai passar agora no vídeo vai ter legenda e também sintam-se 100% à vontade a fazerem, por favor, suas perguntas em português ou em inglês e a gente traduz e eu também posso falar nas duas línguas. My name is Dr. Anya. And I'm going to talk about social justice in applied linguistics, critical perspectives on language teaching, research, and most importantly, our responsibilities in civic engagement. My talk today will begin with examining the high stakes social justice crisis of linguistic discrimination. I'll talk about how language is much more than how we typically conceive of it, which is signs and structures and symbols. I'll talk about attitudes, how we can shift our attitudes and our ideologies on languaging and those who language. And finally, I'll talk about the resources that are out there that we can mobilize for enacting change and engaging in liberatory practice. So first of all, what is applied linguistics? It's an interdisciplinary field fundamentally concerned with examining the complexities and problems and solving problems where language plays a primary role. Now, why do we talk about social justice in applied linguistics, or why do we take a social justice perspective in applied linguistics? Well, if you understand social justice as equity in sharing social resources, benefits, and power, then applied linguistics, which purports to solve problems, should recognize the problems of social justice in language and address how language functions in systems and practices of inequity. So I want to share with you an example of systems and practices of inequity directly related to languaging and languagers. The Arizona Department of Education about 10 years ago enacted a policy where they were targeting ESL teachers for having what was perceived as too heavy of an accent. And these are, if you know the background of the ESL teachers in Arizona, they were, a lot of them primarily transitioned from their duties in bilingual education. And so these were, before in 2000, Prop 203 was passed that mandated English only or English learners to be educated primarily in English and not in their home language along with English. These bilingual teachers had been previously hired specifically because of their bilingual background and their ability to uniquely serve the needs of emergent bilinguals. However, in the English-only regime, what was their strength was perceived as a liability and something for which the powers that be even felt that they shouldn't have their jobs. So go ahead and watch the video.
Some people are saying that teachers like me should not be teaching students who are learning English.
Some teachers like Christina Parsons in Tucson believe they're being targeted by the Arizona Department of Education because they have accents.
A state monitor came into your class.
Yes,
They audited you.
yes. They just walked in the middle of class.
Parsons, who was born in Brazil, has taught ELL, English language learners, for more than 20 years. She has 2 university degrees. This is the first time she's been audited, and she resents the extra scrutiny.
You could have a PhD and be a bad teacher.
State School Superintendent Tom Horn says as part of No Child Left Behind, he's been monitoring ELL teachers for bad grammar and mispronounced words for the past 8 years.
Are you going after one particular accent?
We're not going after any accents, including Spanish accents. It has to be faulty English. If students are being taught English and they're going to refer to a comma as a coma, people are going to misunderstand them.
English professor Roseanne Gonzalez disagrees, saying studies actually show that non-native speakers make better English teachers.
Are you saying that a teacher's pronunciation of specific words is not important?
That's right, because language is very contextual. We depend on the context to understand what words mean.
You would tell somebody who could not be understood that they need to go into another profession.
Of the 1,500 teachers who were monitored last year, 25 were found to have pronunciation issues. That worries teachers Charles Collingwood from Trinidad and Ian Kidd from Ireland, who wonder who's judging.
You can't say there's one way to pronounce anything in America.
See what kids are learning. Those are more important thing than if I say think instead of think.
Horn's critics say he's going after immigrant teachers.
It's totally idiotic. I grew up in a house where my parents spoke Polish, and they certainly spoke English with a heavy accent.
But here you are, superintendent.
Right.
So it didn't hurt you.
No, but my teachers spoke proficient English.
Christina Parsons says she's also proficient.
The Arizona Department of Education gives a certificate saying, yes, you are certified to teach. After that, they say, no, I don't think you can do it, so I'm going to go into the classroom and see if you're doing a good job. Let's go.
Parsons is still awaiting results of her audit. If she doesn't pass, she could be reassigned to another position somewhere else in the district. Thelma Gutierrez, CNN, Tucson, Arizona.
So you can understand what a high-stakes situation this is, because people's livelihoods are involved here. So you can be reassigned, and there's a possibility of, if an adequate reassignment is not found for you, you may be let go. So in the video, you saw they were talking about the monitoring sessions that were held to assess the English language speaking abilities of these teachers. So there were 10-minute sessions. If you can imagine, someone's livelihood or fitness to exercise their profession is going to be dependent on a 10-minute observation of their oral proficiency, usually by some sort of administrator, vice principal, somebody from the district. These were not people who were trained in language assessment, nor did they make public the basis by which they were making these assessments. So they identified some things like Spanish language speaking, which research does support using the first language to develop additional. And they also identified Spanish language teaching materials, wall hangings, which do support the emergent bilinguals in developing in both languages, actually. They saw within the 10-minute sessions that there were improper credentials to teach English learners. Now, if you remember, these were bilingual education teachers that, because of a law, had been transitioned to an English-only classroom. So they were definitely trained in different ways than those who are going to be teaching in an English-dominant setting. And the biggest and most nebulous area that these very brief and definitely not standardized across the board monitoring sessions identified were what people very subjectively perceived as unacceptably heavy accents. And they gave examples such as I don't know whether this is an accent problem, but how do we call it in English? So I believe that they were perceiving somehow that this is not how you would say it in English, but this is not an accent concern or pronunciation concern. They identified saying the word levels, but pronouncing it levels, saying mush, meaning much, and the, right? Or saying leaves, meaning lives. And if you remember, context is king when we're talking about language, and you understand what is being said based on what's around the word, and not necessarily discrete utterances themselves. Now, what do we do when somebody who observes one person has some sort of a perception versus somebody who observes another person, right? And remember, these are very brief observations without any kind of standardization or research backing, that we're making huge decisions about people's lives. So you would think, what's the big deal in making sure that language teachers are speaking the language, that, proficiently speaking the language that they teach? And, well, teachers with bad grammar or bad language models, and Arizona has an English-only law for all government agencies, and the schools are part of the Arizona government. So these were the arguments that were made on behalf of this regime. And in addition to the bad grammar and bad language models, there were quotes from Tom Horn, the superintendent at the time himself, that students should be in a class where teachers can articulate. Once again, we don't understand or have clarity about what it means to articulate, which can be a very subjective assessment. And there's also the concern that, well, few English learners were passing the state standardized test, which, makes a lot of sense. If you're giving people who are emerging in their proficiency in English a huge test solely in the English language, they're not going to do that well. So it's a very big deal, right? When you say, well, language teachers should speak the language, they already do speak the language. These teachers had certification to teach in the state of Arizona, certification conferred by the state of Arizona, and that certification includes language proficiency testing, which they passed. And also, once again, this additional monitoring process, what exactly does it entail? And as I spoke to before, what does it mean? What sort of standard, what is it based on? What sort of standardization happened to make sure that it's being evenly assessed, right? And this notion that, teachers with bad grammar or bad language model, we conflate grammar all the time, or this notion of grammar with other things that have very little to do with grammar. Right? And, first of all, teachers who have the same language and cultural background as students have been proven much more effective as instructors, right, of emergent bilinguals, because they serve as models, and they also understand the process of emerging in expertise in a new language intimately, so they can not only model it, but really explain it and accompany the development in these linguistic practices. And this notion of bad grammar is very woefully misunderstood and conflated with all kinds of things. Pronunciation is called grammar somehow. Grammar has to do with, syntactical structures, right? And putting together utterances, not how those utterances are uttered or, pronounced. So accented speech is not the same as ungrammatical speech. And once again, this notion of accentedness really is a perception issue, right? Because accented just means how much the pronunciation of an utterance sounds different from an expected production pattern. So your perception of pretty much how similar their pronunciation is to what you think it should be. And that's a very, very subjective thing. And test results, right, in these proficiency monitoring and exams, there are all kinds of, we understand that language assessment is influenced by income, opportunity, resources, and structural programs people went through, the validity of the assessments themselves. So these are, this judgment, somebody's subjective judgment of your bad grammar is really not a sufficient basis to decide whether someone should have their job or not. And, the argument that Arizona has an English only law for its government agencies, well, remember that research doesn't usually, or, understanding of linguistics doesn't usually drive these laws. It's usually political animus against immigrants, right? Feeling that, well, you're in America, you should speak English, etc. These are usually the basis of laws like this, because the research says quite the opposite of what the English-only laws mandate. And it has been proven by the research that bilingual education and dual language immersion is what actually helps the most in developing linguistic expertise in a new language, and not the sink or swim English-only model. So, understanding now that we are not just talking about systems and structures and even grammars, right? When we talk about language, it's a much more expansive idea, right? So we talk about discourse when we talk about language, and discourse is understood as oral, written, symbolic, and embodied speech. So much more than just, the speech that comes out of your mouth or that you write. It has to do with the way we language our bodies and the symbols and the images, right, as well. And in addition to that, language, much more than just mere systems and structures of signs and symbols, language is something that we do. It's a localized social meaning-making and signifying action, right, or practice. And in languaging, in doing of language, we fight a lot. We struggle over what's true, and we struggle a lot about power to be able to name truth and to be able to name people. And language is where we do a lot of work in thinking, in constructing and defining realities, giving voice to experience. And very importantly, language is where we define ourselves and others, right? So when you think about the struggles that we engage in languaging and defining ourselves and others, I want to give you some examples of some fights that happen. So around the mid-20th century, there was this struggle over what is the title that you put in front of women's names, right? A title that usually determines or reveals somebody's civil status. Are they married or unmarried? So an unmarried woman will have Miss, M-I-S-S, in front of her name, and a married woman will have Mrs., right? And a lot of judgments were made on women's fitness to work, their suitability. For example, if you had a Miss in front of your name and you were up for employment, you're unmarried, maybe you're going to get married and leave the job, maybe we shouldn't hire you. If you have a Mrs. in front of your name and you're up for employment, you're married, maybe you're going to have a baby or be too dedicated to your home and you can't really give much to the job, we're not going to hire you. So, a lot of, decisions like that were made about women and their abilities and their place and their role and their money, right? And their access to benefits and resources based essentially on what the title in front of them said about their relationship with a man. So feminists argued that we shouldn't be defined that way. So you would call women Ms. because that way you didn't know if she was a Miss or a Mrs. and you didn't make these judgment calls. More recently, we talk about the word thug, and the dictionary definition would be a delinquent of some sort, criminal, but we know thug has been doing a lot of work lately, linguistically, and we've been struggling over, what it means. And a lot of people know that recently thug is, a more polite or socially acceptable way to say the N-word. And, we've seen people who don't read as criminal or, delinquent being called a thug, right? Because, they're usually black men who others want to portray in a certain way, but, it's in polite society, we don't say nigger, right? So we have another word that we're struggling over right now, this notion of illegals, calling human beings, an illegal versus somebody who doesn't have papers or, who's undocumented, right? And, in the struggle over who gets to tell the truth and who has the power to determine how we frame and how we view others, we also are doing work in determining how we think about and how we treat others. So when you call human beings illegals, or you're talking about their very legitimacy, right? And their belonging, and you're naming them criminal in their very existence. So we're languaging and we're struggling right now over if that is somebody's truth. And we're, writing letters, for example, to, New York Times, can you not use that framing and use undocumented instead because it's more accurate language, and it's also takes away the power of telling some perceived truth about somebody that really is not. So this is an example of a lot that we're doing with language and how we're languaging. So back to the notion of accents, right? I talked previously about how perception has a lot to do with accents, because essentially accents are jointly constructed by both speakers and hearers, right? Rubin and Yi, over decades of research have run very similar experiments where they show two different pictures, right? And but they had the same audio for this picture, and they were asking actually undergraduate students, usually from the U.S., native English speaking, looking at these people, do you hear an accent when you're hearing them talk? And it's really interesting, the findings, very consistent findings from these studies, that Asian appearance alone determined the perception of accentedness in speech. Even when the voice recordings had non-Asian language accents. So just based upon our ideologies or social concepts or popular image about usually the otherness, right, of Asians, or the perpetual foreignness of them, it was difficult for a lot of people to make the connection that an Asian-looking person is going to be speaking English, quote unquote, like a regular American, right? So these perceptions are very, very ingrained in us and have a lot more to do with ideologies than often the actual utterances that people are making. So thinking and knowing that accents are jointly constructed, and accents have a lot to do with perceptions of people hearing and perceiving the accents, you really have to think about, should we be making decisions, administrative decisions about people's jobs, about people's fitness to exercise their job, based on perceptions, very subjective perceptions and assessments of how they talk? And we know this because perceptions in this research that I'm describing, perceptions of accentedness, affected how those who were hearing and perceiving the accents judged the speaker's teaching ability. So they were, in these studies, asking undergraduates how they ranked people who had accent, or had them watch, for example, people with Korean accents teach, and they were making perceptions about not their speaking, but now their ability to teach based on how thick the accent was perceived to be, right? So when the students perceived be it right or be it wrong, right, high levels of foreign accentedness in these studies, they judge the speakers to be poor teachers. So when you think about the bias, right, that's entrenched in how we perceive accents, and by extension the bearers of accents, once again I ask, do we allow our systems and structures and administrations to make decisions about people's abilities in exercising their profession based on how we perceive them speaking? So Libby Green tells us, well, no, because language discrimination is almost, the final frontier of, what is still acceptable, unquestioned discrimination in our society, right? She says that accent serves as the first point of gatekeeping because we're, typically forbidden by, let's say, law or by, social norms of respectability, right? From using race, ethnicity, homeland, or economics more directly, although we do it all the time, right? But we don't have to lie or hide or pretend about linguistic oppression and linguistic discrimination. We have no such compunction, Libby Green says, about discriminating based on language. Therefore, accent becomes a litmus test for a lot of the exclusion that we do, and an excuse to turn people away and to refuse to recognize the other. Here's a PSA that was very popular on television, reminding us that language discrimination is not a sound basis, or the way perceptions of somebody's nationality, for example, or their background based on how they talk, and denying them housing for that is illegal, in addition to being immoral. But I wanted to play this clip for you to understand that we make a lot of judgments, right, based on how people language that are intimately tied with the stigma and the judgment and the prejudice and the bigotry that we typically hold against that particular population.
Hello. Yes. Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Oh, it's gone. Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It's not available.
Not available?
Hello, my name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment on Park Street.
Just been rented.
Hello, I am Chen Ling. My name is Khalid bin Ali. I'm Tuan Vo.
Hello, my name is Moshe Goldberg. I use a wheelchair.
It's gone. Not available. All right. Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Really?
So usually when we look at discrimination and profiling, right, it's, we're typically talking about those who are disadvantaged and oppressed by that. Let's also keep in mind those who directly benefit, right, from the othering and from the disadvantaging of these others, right? So we have those who we think are good models of speech, or therefore, good models of humanity, often that extension that we make, right? And good teachers, etc., because they speak the right sort of way. So those are the ones that are benefiting in this system that is discriminating and oppressing others. So I wanted to ask you some questions about how this has affected your personal life and your work, for example. Have you experienced surprise or questions about, wow, you speak English so well, right? Or pressure to pay for accent reduction services, or your intelligence or your abilities to do your job, right? Based on being judged unfavorably. Based on perceptions of your language proficiency, or based on the type of English that you speak, right? We see this linguistic stigma attached to African Americans who speak African American language very, very frequently. And we understand that this tremendous bigotry against the language of Black people is intimately tied with the racism and anti-Blackness leveled against Black people in general as a population. Have you experienced your teaching evaluations, for example, mentioning specifically your speaking ability, right? And we saw in the research that, Ruben and Yi that I talked about previously, that people's abilities in teaching were negatively ranked, directly correlating with, how accented their English speaking was perceived. Have you experienced employment negotiations, for example, or opportunities influenced by perceptions of your language proficiency? So when we talk about all of this, and we see the problems, the magnitude, right, of a problem we have in social justice when we examine language, what do we do, right? And we're so overwhelmed. We have so much going on, so much on our plate already, and 2020 has been a year, right? What can we do when our hands are so tied already? Well, I want to also ask, right, what is the role that we should take in being better informed ourselves and also educating others about these critical issues in languaging, especially since we understand that they aren't as simple as, bad grammar or they just don't speak well enough, right? We understand they're a lot more tied into ideologies and negative attitudes and discrimination and systemic inequity. So what can we do, therefore, to promote social justice in our own fields of language and cultural studies where, I work and where all of you do as well, right? Well, the first thing is we abandon this talking heads notion or this view of languagers and languaging, right? We don't treat languagers as just, people who are, speaking, right? We consider their entirety, right? We take a holistic human view of people's identities and people's practices and people's repertoires and who they are in their languaging, right? And starting from that, I want to introduce you to Dr. Jose Medina, who you should follow him on Twitter, on the TikToks, on everything, right? Because he is fantastic and a wonderful resource in understanding in very accessible ways this notion of linguistic oppression. And I wanted to play you a couple of his videos. First of all, this first one I'm going to play for you has to do with his reaction to the negative responses that he got from a previous video that he made where he was saying that we should not linguistically oppress students in the classroom who speak non-prestige varieties of language. And a lot of people shot back at him saying, hey, are you championing uneducated speech or bad speech, etc.? And he talks to us about how that in itself is linguistic oppression, that attitude. And he talks about the research basis behind it. And I also, in addition to that video, want to play another where he gives a very clear example of doing it right, right? Not being a linguistic oppressor and not participating in the systemic inequity and social injustice that we impose upon others based on language. So, Dr. Medina.
So I was really surprised by the opposing reactions to the linguistic oppression video that I posted a couple of days ago. And some of the viewers were really offended by the words bos and huacha and troca and calling it the language of the uneducated or los del rancho, or it's not español puro, which is so crazy because I think we may have missed the point of the video, which is about context. The research, and I as somebody who engages in that work, we're not dictating that kids shouldn't be able to mobilize what we in schools call academic language. What we're saying is that we don't have to destroy the bos to help kids at the pues. And if a child or an adult says troca, we need to understand that that's fabulous because they've mobilized truck and camioneta and combined them. That's translanguaging that they're doing. And so I would tell a kid, I love that you use troca, but let's also add truck and camioneta so that based on the context, you're able to mobilize it all. Look at you. Our job is to sustain and expand linguistic repertoires. Adios.
Sustain and expand, right? Instead of being oppressors, we look to honor identities, sustain them, right? And also expand understandings and repertoires without harming and enacting in oppressive systems.
When a child says, my mom is planching my clothes, we say, oh my goodness, look at you moving the parts of language that you needed. Do you know what you just did? You moved planchando and you moved ironing and you combined them to say planching. I love that. That is fabulous. We want to keep that. We want to sustain that. But we also want to expand your language bubble. So we're going to go ahead and add planchando and ironing so that depending on the context, you can say, my mom is planching because we love planching, but you can also move planchando and ironing. Mi mamá está planchando. Oh, my mom is ironing my clothes. Mira, mira, translanguaging away. When a child...
So this is what we can do, right? In very real ways, not just in classrooms, but in our social interactions, right? Paying attention and honoring as whole selves what languages are doing, how they're languaging, and sustaining those languaging practices which are linked to people's identities, right? Honoring those cultures and at the same time supporting the expansion of repertoires. So other resources that we have out there that we can grab onto and use to learn how to engage or how to engage in liberatory practices, right, of understanding language and mobilizing linguistic resources, right? And we have these possibilities with our language organizations. We have ACTFL, for example, that provides for us research groups, teacher groups, right, and webinars, publications, all sorts of resources that address issues of race, diversity, and social justice. We have Society for Linguistic Anthropology that does the same. We have the American Association for Applied Linguistics, right, which is now more and more understanding that we need to face and address the issue of social justice and linguistic justice, specifically in applied linguistics. And we have the social justice listserv of AAAL that you can join. And you can receive information about opportunities, about webinars, and about mobilization that you can do, activism that you can do, collaborations that you can do on this very important goal of enacting justice in language studies. And even the MLA has resources. The Style Guide, for example, the Style Center actually has suggestions of projects that you can do in classes, teaching writing, for example, but with Black Lives Matter as a theme, or other social justice commitments and understandings in the work that we do languaging. So there's a lot of research and publishing that we can access as well, right? Through the language organizations, we can collaborate actually in those projects in the research and publishing. We can also read and digest the work that's already been done. So I have just a few titles here for you, and I also have a list of references at the end that includes these titles. Examples, we have critical pedagogy and liberatory practices in the Spanish language classroom. We have teaching languages through the lens of social justice. We have Linguistic Justice, a fantastic book by April Baker Bell on Black language and literacy identity and pedagogy, and work that I did with L.J. Randolph on diversifying our networks, diversifying our research, diversifying our educators and our learning in language education. And social media and the web just replete with opportunities. This is just but a tiny smidgen of what you can find out there. Take a look at all the Tweety birds. These are all @s of people that you really should be following and accompanying their work. Nelson Flores, We Teach Language, has a weekly Lang Chat where language teachers primarily discuss issues of linguistic justice. April Baker Bell, her work specifically on African Americans in our schools and Black language. She's also a collaborator with the Black Language Syllabus, which is a whole web project on knowing and understanding Black language and understanding the role that we have in countering and really fighting against linguistic oppression that we know is enacted against African Americans right for the same reasons and on the same justification, right, as the actual bigotry and systemic exclusion, anti-Blackness and racism enacted on African Americans as a people. We have Jose Medina that I mentioned before, Ann Charity Hudley, L.J. Randolph, Jonathan Rosa, and Vijay Ramjatan is very, very important to accompany his work as well because he specifically focuses on accents. And just following his Twitter, you learn so much about notions of accentedness in speech, notions of professionalism, and the racism that we enact through those concepts of appropriateness and cultures of professionalism in language and in our systems and institutions. We have a very important project out of the Center for Participatory Change. They produce a language justice curriculum for those who work in translation and interpretation, and to look at their language work, right, as more than just translation, because we know no type of language work is apolitical or neutral. So instead of enacting oppression through the language work that we do, the language justice curriculum and the work that social justice linguists do supports doing that work for liberation and for the benefit of social justice and not to enact oppression. And if you're active on Facebook, there are countless groups on Facebook focusing on language and social justice. For example, the Language Justice Cooperative, Tilde, out of North Carolina. So this is just a drop of what you could be doing and having access to in really fighting against the systemic injustice, the practices that we enact through linguistic oppression, and also being aware of our role in perpetuating this type of oppression and our role in understanding how we're involved in these systems, how we can counteract them, and how we can educate others, not just in our lives, but in our work, in the institutions that we're part of, to engage in justice. Okay, so these are the references that you can take a closer look at later, and thank you so much for this opportunity to work with you and to exchange with you, And I look forward to our conversation in the Q&A.
Welcome back, everyone. This is just an amazing presentation, Dr. Anya. We couldn't be more grateful for those amazing, critical, concrete, theoretically informed thinking about language teaching and learning in light of social transformation. You know, what is it that we need to do in order to be able to change the field, also change our own perceptions, right? And interrupt our own perceptions. It begins with us. And now we will just go ahead and let's see, look at different questions and comments that participants might have, so we can begin to answer them, or Dr. Anya will begin to answer them. Let's see. We have a question from Support Accent Way, who says, how do they define bad grammar?
First of all, thank you so much. And I'm excited to be here. How do they define bad grammar? That was the problem with this policy. They did not have a systematized way of identifying the problems, or even telling us what kinds of problems they were going to look at, or even showing us the protocol that they would use to make these observations. It was all based on subjective judgments of, I think you just don't speak right. They wouldn't say that that was what was happening, but when you don't produce information to back up what type of assessment that you're implementing, and also when the assessment that you say you're doing, a 10-minute monitoring system, does not in any way conform to standards that are already out there for oral proficiency assessments. And there's even a problem with, why are you giving oral proficiency assessments in the first place to people who already got teacher certification, where there was an oral proficiency component? And who are the people administering these? These were people's vice principals or administrators, or some district representative would come into your class randomly to listen to how you were talking. So the notion of, well, you're just using bad grammar, even the examples they gave for what bad grammar was not grammatical or grammar based. It had to do with how people were pronouncing things. And then they called it grammar. So that the question that you're asking was our huge question as well. Like, how do you define bad grammar? And there were even bigger issues than that. And the biggest being the whole test regime itself.
It's a big regime to take down. We have a question from, let's see, the next one is from Florencia Paciaroni, and Florencia says, what was the conception of language, lingua, that was considered to test these teachers? And what was the teaching learning approach that guided those courses of language teaching where those teachers worked?
So these notions of what language was, or how the teachers were trained, these teachers came from schools of education, and these were all certified teachers who not only passed their exams and preparation and training to graduate with licensure to be able to teach, they also had to go through credentialing by the very state of Arizona to be able to teach. So for you to understand the concepts that they were using to make assessments of their proficiency going in for them to be able to teach, or the methodologies that they were taught and they were tested on, you would have to look into the schools that they were prepared at, and the standards or the exams and the preparation and the credentialing regime of the state.
We have a great comment from Heidi D'Amello, who says, I love the power of using language as verbs, languaging and languagers. And that became very obvious, right, in your presentation, the idea that using language it's really an action. It's language as action, and it's actually language as action goes beyond language as function, right? And language as structure. And it seems that we're heading towards that way in thinking about language. So Ivania has another question that says, do you have any suggestions, Dr. Anya, on how rubrics and standards of assignments could be informed by this information? How can we use this information to reconsider how we standardize assignments that promote linguistic racism? Any resources I can access to navigate this issue would be appreciated.
So I would suggest you accessing the work of those who do language assessment research, but with a critical eye. And also those who are currently in the conversation of how we're assessing emergent bilinguals, for example, at the K through 12 level. So I gave a huge name for you that you really should chase after, Jose Medina, and also in the chat description, Ana Celia Centella, her name came up, as well as someone who's on the forefront of this. We have Ofelia Garcia, who does a lot of work in this area, Nelson Flores, who also talks about how is it that we're looking at how languaging happens in the schools, what are our standards, what are the ideologies that have to do with what we perceive as academic language versus non-standardized or bastardized, or however we tend to look at it. And they look at it very specifically through the lens of the understanding that human beings are the ones not just doing the languaging, but also perceiving the languaging. So we have to check the perceivers and the hearers instead of focusing so much on what the speakers are doing or saying wrong. So these are just a few names off the top of my head that you can look into that would lead you toward the trail of more practical applications in assessment that take these considerations into consideration.
Yeah, and an important scholar, Margot Gottlieb, I think is moving in that direction as well. She's an amazing scholar of language assessment in education and with bilingual children, emergent bilingual students. So her work also should be of interest. I believe that Dr. Rob Larkins also would like to respond to this question.
Oh, no. I was just organizing the Q&A.
Okay,
Sorry.
got it. All right. So we have a question from Tiare Spitz-Johnson, who says, it seems like implicit biases play a big role in people's perception of others' accents and use of language. What are some ways we can work to reduce these biases within society?
So that's the big topic of today, right?
That's right.
Is what can we do to reduce these biases? Well, the first thing that we can do is to recognize what's going on, right? And recognize the ideologies, and recognize even before that the mechanism of languaging, right? So we're going to abandon this notion that there's objectivity in our meaning making, right? Everything we hear, everything we perceive, read, any kind of interaction we have is filtered through our identities, our histories, our backgrounds, our attitudes, our bigotries, our understandings of how the world works, or ideologies about how the world or language should work. So the first thing we should do is to understand this, first of all, that we're not just approaching language purely, if you will, or okay, you're doing it badly or you're doing it well. We're reading people and we're making judgments that are intimately linked with who these people are and perceived to be, and their status in racist hierarchies, classist and elitist hierarchies as well. So we have to remember first and foremost that the languaging that people do and how we perceive it is how we tend to perceive those people as well. And we have to also understand that what we've established as standards of high language is how certain people talk, and the people who established the standards of high society, for example. Our standards in language come from the languaging practices of elites. So when we think about all of that, and we also think that languaging has to do with what you need to do, the meanings that you need to make, and communication problems that you're going to solve, the interactions that you're going to have. So when we think about that, as opposed to there's a correct way and then there's an incorrect way, when we shift away from that sort of thinking and try to understand languaging in terms of meaning making, in terms of interaction, etc., and then look at, you know, the baggage behind all of that, then with that perspective, we can then attack the problems of linguistic discrimination. So without first recognizing that concepts such as professionalism, cultural fit, those are all, you know, masked, not so masked ways of, you know, being racist usually, and being exclusive, elitist. So language ties into all of that. So one big thing that we're doing is this, you know, Freirean notion of conscientização, right? Raising awareness of how these things function, so then we can try to dismantle them.
Great. We do have a comment, a question actually from Marcela Caprario, who says, is that program targeting ESL instructors still being enacted in Arizona? Do you know, Dr. Anya?
No, it's not.
Good.
We fought really hard. we had protests. We ran conferences. We made a lot of noise. We got people in the University of Arizona, and we didn't just get them. The people already in the University of Arizona were vociferously just attacking and criticizing and demanding answers and justification for why they were doing what they were doing. And eventually they cut it out.
And we see actually what's really interesting, that what I've seen, for example, when, you know, international schools, you know, put these ads looking for English teachers, they're always looking for native speakers, right? So even at a very international level, you know, this very idea that the native speaker, which is this idealized, you know, a speaker here that perhaps doesn't really exist, right? Seems to be the bar, right, in terms of linguistic purity or authenticity. And the idea that, well, the children are going to learn from someone who is a native, authentic speaker of that language. And sort of, what does that mean? It's really, to me, so important to question and trouble that, to queer that.
I agree. I 100%, especially since it causes a lot of trouble. This notion that, number one, just because you've inherited a language, that you are an authority in every possible aspect of the language. Once again, because languages are connected to identities. So we tend to not just say a native speaker is, in the example of English, the best type of English speaker. We tend to say that the inner circle native speaker, right? The US native speaker, the British native speaker, Australian, New Zealand native speaker is the authority in English, or the best possible example in English. And then even within those inner circles, we say the white people are the representatives of legitimacy and authenticity in English language speaking, which then translates to English language teaching. So, which then means that there's going to be profound racial bigotry and discrimination in who gets the best jobs in teaching English, who gets considered authorities in how we should. And we already know that as far as teaching language, people who've had to learn that language are extremely good models and really effective in understanding and being able to do well in teaching the language. And the assumption that just because you inherited or grew up speaking it, we understand this is flawed. So once we get past these notions of the superiority, for example, of the native speaker, we can attack the problems of racism and stigma that's attached to the reification of a native speaker, a white native speaker of English, for example. And then also we can look at how we can really be effective in the work that we do, because these are barriers to us ultimately teaching and learning well, especially because people think that they can't learn English or any language unless they're talking to a native speaker, right? So this is a big problem and a barrier to people having all the interactional possibilities that they can in language learning, because they have this thing in front of them that I have to speak a certain way and it has to be modeled after this speaker, and I can't really get any bang for my buck in language learning unless I'm dealing with a sect of hallowed speakers. E eu gostaria também de dizer que se alguém quiser fazer uma pergunta em português ou no chat, ou como quiser, estou também aqui prestes a ajudar e responder e esclarecer.
Muito bom. Vamos ver se há alguma pergunta em português aqui. Melinda Martin, muito obrigada, doutora Uju, Anya, e parabéns pela palestra interessante e importante. Would love to hear more about how you think research connects, builds upon Freire's work of conscientização.
I believe I hinted at that. Obrigada, primeiro. I hinted at that, actually said it earlier, that the awareness raising, right? Understanding how language works, understanding how linguistic oppression and racism and stigma that's attached to our languaging practices work is conscientização, right? It's consciousness raising. And also, we can't just raise awareness, right? Action, right, has to accompany that, right? In Freire's notion of liberatory practice, right, or praxis. So now that we know how this works, or now that we understand the attitudes and the ideologies, now that we understand how accentedness functions, now that we've seen the research on how this is used and mobilized against, then we can take this into consideration and form action in research, in teaching, and in civic engagement based upon that. E eu queria dizer que essa noção freiana de conscientização, né, eu falei antes sobre, primeiramente, temos que saber, né, de que se trata linguagem, né, como é, e saber também, né, que o estigma e discriminação, né, intolerância, que linguística, tudo está muito estreitamente ligado ao estigma, ao racismo, à intolerância às pessoas, né, os falantes e os sujeitos, né, associados a certas formas de falar e certas tradições de falar. Então, ter essa consciência, né, ter essa noção, saber disso, é o primeiro passo que podemos tomar em criar uma prática, né, entrar em ação, né, na pesquisa, no ensino e também nas nossas interações sociais e também cívicas, né, e também nas políticas de educação, né, ter essa conscientização guia aos passos e ação que vamos tomar nessas áreas.
We do have another question from Ramon S. He says, Dear Professor Anya, I have noticed linguistic racism against foreign nationals in the following ways. The accents of white folks from another country, right? In my experience, Brazilian academic guests are called out more than Black and brown folks from the same country, regardless of the errors or mispronunciations. This racism is often subtle. How can we as educators and administrators call people committing these offenses in without alienating them or stand up for justice in these instances. And what it seems to me is that here we can see the Brazilian approach, that it isn't just about the oppressor, it's also about the liberation of the oppressed. So how is it that we could call these out without...
Can you please guide me to where it is in the Q&A so I can read the question?
Yes,
I don't always process audio.
So it's Ramon S. Ramon S. We have it in the chat as, I noticed that accents, he also says, I noticed that accents and grammatical errors of Brazilian guests were not treated equally according to the race of the guest. White Brazilians, when committing linguistic errors, tended to be caught a lot more slack than Black and brown Brazilians. So it's kind of the race issue. This was because of race, not the actual errors themselves. I refer to these as linguistic racism. How can we as educators and administrators call people committing these offenses in without alienating them or stand up for justice in these instances? It's related.
It's really difficult to solve problems by first thinking about how you're going to manage white fragility or the sensitivity of bigots, especially when we're dealing with problems that are recognizable very openly as bigotry. So the approach would be to ask, do you notice the same thing from such and such a person as you're noticing from another? Or another approach would be can we look at our ratings and our how reliable our assessments are? There's an example there's a lot of college panels where you would go for those international students who have to teach their international graduate students, and they have to teach undergrad classes. So if they're perceived somehow as not having sufficiently advanced or appropriate English to be able to do that, they go through testing for oral proficiency, and then the testing process involves them actually teaching a sample class and being ranked and evaluated by a panel of testers. And participating in groups like that, I've noticed personally that when the Italians or the French are teaching, there's a lot of, my goodness, what a lovely accent. Let's give you some positive, engaging criticism, if any. But then when we have the Indians or the Chinese or the Koreans or the Africans that are being tested, there's a lot more, and the faces aren't so melty, and the idea of their accent isn't as sexy, if you will, or considered desirable in its foreignness, right? So even in official areas with people who are, trained and there to make these assessments supposedly in objective ways, we see social biases of desirability in foreignness or, in accented English come out. So talking very openly about what our standards are, about perceptions of inequity, and testing the testers, and also talking to the testers about linguistic bias and something that we ourselves may not perceive that we're participating in, I believe would be steps that are helpful in attacking this problem. But once again, I would not have my first step be to worry about the sensitivity of people who are committing linguistic oppression and doing harm against others. My worry is about the injustice.
That is correct. Dr. Anya, there is to two questions that I think are related or interrelated. One from Kim Hansen, who says, I have a question about buy-in from other language teacher students. I presented on critical approaches for qualitative research methods to my classmates, and they resisted, saying that their institutions and governments would not support it. They didn't seem interested in addressing injustice in their classroom. And I was disappointed, right? Oh, just a second, I lost it there. And I was disappointed, to say the least. And then the other question is from Leonardo da Silva from Brazil, who says, I guess one important point is that in order to promote social justice education, one needs to understand that education is political, right? In the sense that it can either reproduce or question the status quo. At the same time, I feel very threatened nowadays. I work in the Brazilian context, since teachers have been accused of indoctrinating, right? Or being indoctrinators by neoconservative groups and discourses. Like there is a social fear of terms such as social justice, gender, sexuality, etc. What are your thoughts on the challenges of being a critical educator in such a reactionary times? And I'm thinking sort of the idea of buy-in with this idea of, oops, you know, the broader structures are not supporting critical dialogue right now.
So the first step would be to collect research, right? And approach, there is research that's already out there in the market that serves for an open view of what is going on. Because when you have these conversations, the first accusation is that this is your problem, or this is something that you're just facing yourself, or you have an agenda. And to let you know that there is research, research that's gone for decades, like on the problems that you are talking about. So on racism, on stigma, on gender discrimination, you name it. So identifying this research and presenting it as backup for the claims and the possibilities and the policies that you would like to make is very, very helpful if you work in an environment where people are willing to listen, right? Also, collaborating by presenting the research, by talking about it, by taking into consideration stakeholders like students, for example, or the research populations that we're dealing with. So talking about these populations and talking with those who have to serve their needs and expressing openly, well, this is what's going on, right? And collaborating with our colleagues in understanding, okay, this is happening, how can we organize and unite to present some sort of a front to administration, for example, in an institution, to show them what it is that we're doing, right? Or to show them what it is that's right, or to, you know, project, well, how is this going to benefit us in the future? Raise enrollment, how is this preventing the problems that we're having now? So my big response is that you can't do this alone, right? So how do you get other people on board is typically sharing the information with them, organizing those who can, you know, who are stakeholders, getting them to think about beneficiaries and serving needs, and then as you're building these groups, trying to face bigger adversaries, if you will, right? It is not easy. Let me just say that openly. It is not easy to talk about linguistic discrimination. It is not easy to talk about racism, right? Especially in places where people want to close their eyes and pretend that none of this is real and it's not happening, right? So I cannot guarantee that your results are going to be fast or immediate. However, we can't really do anything unless we do it.
And I hear from you, Dr. Anya, that we really need courage, right? This work is, it takes courage to do this work. It takes courage to be on the side of justice and equality. We have a question from James Watts that says, how much does the political landscape influence education policy?
In every single way.
And is that where changes need to happen and not at the classroom school level?
Both, right? So change definitely has to happen at the policy level because the politics are influencing money, right? Politics influence the resources that we dedicate to recognizing and serving the needs of, let's say, emergent bilinguals or those we call English learners. The politics influence the texts that we choose, the approaches, the pedagogy. The politics influence the people who get hired or who get selected in leadership positions. So we definitely have to be talking at that level and working at that level along with at the school level and also at the classroom level. So this is a multifaceted. There can't be just teachers talking about it or just administrators within an institution talking about it. It has to go bigger with the districts and it has to go bigger with lawmakers. So then perhaps talk to unions about how certain policies are going to make, the professional lives easier. Talk to parent groups to understand about how this benefits or doesn't their children. So there are so many different parties that have to be engaged. And this is why I really, really favor talking online about things like this and mobilizing on social media, because this is where a lot of people get information, they get news, they get understandings and just learn new things about what they didn't imagine before or know before about many common realities.
We have another question from minha querida professora Cássia de Abreu, em português, que diz, que tipos de discriminação linguística você pesquisou no Brasil? E como o trabalho do Freire lhe ofereceu framework de pesquisa? Obrigada.
Desculpe, onde foi que você leu isso?
Cássia de Abreu.
Cássia de Abreu.
Está abaixo, muito embaixo.
Sim.
Cássia de Abreu, que tipos de discriminação linguística você pesquisou no Brasil?
Eu, no Brasil, ainda não pesquisei a discriminação linguística, porque a minha área de pesquisa se situa aqui nos Estados Unidos. Mas há grupos no Brasil agora que estão fazendo isso, né? E que você pode contar nesse momento, você pode entrar em contato ou pesquisar, né, os estudos feitos pelos integrantes desse grupo. O primeiro que estou pensando é Repense, se chama REPENSE, Repense, que é um grupo de pesquisadores negros e negras que especificamente trabalha nessas questões. Right? Então, em Repense, você vai ter tradutores, você vai ter professores, pesquisadores, um monte de pessoas que trabalham nessa área de língua e linguagem e que tem esse approach, essa orientação de justiça social e que também estão promovendo a participação do povo negro, não apenas como integrantes, né, do campo, da disciplina, mas também como sujeitos de pesquisa e tal. Então, uma obra que estou pensando, ou um projeto que estou pensando agora, lembrando, é o projeto de português. Right? Essa noção de que há uma forma, né, de negros brasileiros falarem e tem uma história cultural e linguística dessa forma de falar e que está tendo mais e mais pesquisas sobre português, sobre as conexões linguísticas e também sobre o estigma e o racismo no sistema educacional brasileiro, conectado diretamente com o racismo e antinegritude contra esse povo. Então, por favor, pesquise ou procure e repense. Estão muito ativos no Instagram e também tem um Twitter. E seguindo o caminho, né, desse grupo, vai abrir muitas áreas para você.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Temos tempo para uma pergunta, mais uma pergunta. Qual será essa pergunta que você queira responder, doutora Anya? Se você tem acesso às perguntas, você quer responder a uma em particular?
Bom, estou lendo todas.
Estou lendo todas. Todas essas perguntas são muito interessantes, né? Todas essas perguntas são muito interessantes.
Nossa!
Nossa!
Escolhe aí para mim.
Ok. Vamos fazer Betty Samraj. It seems that even in discussions of diversity and inclusion on university campuses, discrimination based on language is often overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have suggestions for making administrators more sensitive to this? Do you have suggestions from your own institutions of highlighting linguistic discrimination? Say, even in how faculty might be evaluated for tenure and promotion?
Yes. The suggestion is those of you with these ideas and consciousness, right, about these problems to participate much more heavily in terms of your service that directly relates to decision-making in these areas. For example, at my institution, I participate in service related to the equity team that looks at racial equity and other forms of promoting social justice within the College of Education at Penn State. And I also volunteer to participate in the committee to help formulate the strategic initiatives or the strategic plan or the mission for the next 5 years of the university, for the College of Education. So when we were having conversations in these committees, especially talking about what would be the goals, what are we looking at for research priorities, for tenure and promotion, etc., I brought up notions of linguistic discrimination. And when we're talking about how do we define diversity, for example, and equity, in addition to looking at race and gender, sexual identities and social class, etc., I made sure that we specifically talked about, well, let's look at linguistic discrimination, let's look at linguistic diversity, let's also look at how it is that we're evaluating based on language, or even when we're in department meetings or just regular meetings, and I speak up regarding, well, how are we going to take into consideration that not everybody here speaks English as their first language. So off the top of my mind, for you thinking about, kind of penetrating the areas where policies and decisions are made, that has to do with your participation in those as well. And you can also send suggestions, present, very short statement on the research that shows this is a factor and this is a factor. How are we, for example, looking at student evaluations? Do we recognize that they have serious biases against people of color, against people who are younger, and against people who are perceived as heavily accented, or just accented in general? So making suggestions and proposals and backing them up with information about, the research that's out there that shows why this is a problem and what's going on, I believe would be, good steps in solving these problems.
That is indeed. It seems to me also, Dr. Anya, for example, that, many a times us as scholars have to, in some way or another, if we're publishing in languages other than English, we have to justify that, and we have to provide a translation for that, right? And also the idea is sort of like, are we allowed to perhaps publish in translanguaging or other modalities, or a variety of our language? How can doctoral students also be allowed to write dissertations in those modalities and those varieties? In academia, it seems that we really want diversity, but it's really tough to create an environment where diversity, linguistic and other types of diversity, can thrive and can be seen as an asset rather than a liability, right? So creating those contexts where diversity matters will be so important. Do you have any last words for us today?
First of all, my last word is always thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to share ideas. And I really want you to take your ideas and what you've gained from here, or what you already know and the connections you can make, to be vocal about the problems that we have, to be vocal about linguistic oppression, and to be vocal and not just be vocal, but also collaborative, and take the initiative in joining groups that would solve these problems. And also to understand that there's research out there that support what we do and what we purport to do. So please look up this research, or engage in social media with sources that present these ideas to you, so you can also be prepared to present them yourselves in meetings and contexts when deciding policies, and also in training and engaging with other professionals.
I want to say, on behalf of the College of Education, I want to say thank you so much for such a thoughtful, such an inspiring, inaugural Paulo Freire lecture on social transformation and education. Dr. Larkins.
I just wanted to echo the thank you. Thank you so much for just a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot from it, and thank you to everyone here for such an incredible Q&A. Lots and lots of questions that we weren't able to answer yet, unfortunately. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Anya, so much for your time.
Thank you.